The house stood at the end of a quiet street, where the paint had faded and the wind carried whispers of memories long gone. Inside that old house lived Margaret Dawson, known to the neighborhood as Grandma Maggie. Once, her home had been filled with laughter, children's footsteps, and the smell of warm apple pie. But now it was silent, save for the ticking of a lonely clock that seemed to remind her how much time had passed since anyone truly cared to visit. Her children had grown busy with their own lives. Thomas, her eldest, lived in the city with his wife and 2 teenage sons. He often promised to visit but never did. "Next weekend, Mom," he'd say over the phone, though that weekend never came. Her daughter, Elaine, lived just a few miles away, but treated every call from her mother as a burden, often cutting the conversation short with a polite excuse. Margaret never complained. She understood that life had a way of pulling people apart, even from those they loved most. Still, there was a quiet ache in her chest every time she saw families walking together outside her window. Children laughing, parents smiling. It reminded her of the days when her own family had gathered in her kitchen, when her home had been a haven of warmth and love. Now, she lived among fading photographs and dust-covered furniture, clinging to the hope that one day her children might remember the woman who once gave them everything. Each morning, she prepared 2 cups of tea, one for herself and one for the memory of her late husband, George. She would sit by the window, sip slowly, and talk to him as if he were still there. "They're busy, George," she'd whisper softly. "But I know they still love me." Deep down, though, she wondered if love could survive silence for so long. The seasons changed outside her window, yet her days remained the same, quiet, predictable, and lonely. Even on her birthday, there were no calls, no cards, not even a message. Only a reminder from the calendar on her wall that she had grown 1 year older, alone. She placed a single candle in a cupcake she had baked herself, closed her eyes, and made a wish she had made many times before, that her family might one day remember her. But life has a way of testing hearts. One evening, as the rain fell softly against her window, Margaret felt a sharp pain in her chest. It wasn't the first time, but this one was different, deeper, colder. She sat there for hours, staring at the framed photo of her children, her mind flooded with memories of laughter and love. That night, she made a quiet decision. If her family had forgotten her in life, she would make sure they never forgot her in death. And so began the plan that would change everything. The next morning, the air in the old house felt heavier, as if it understood the weight of what Grandma Maggie had decided. She rose from bed slowly, the ache in her body reminding her that her time was growing short. But her eyes, though tired, carried a new spark, one of quiet determination. For the next few weeks, she spent her mornings writing letters, sorting through papers, and making phone calls. She visited her lawyer, a kind man named Mr. Benson who had helped her with small matters before. This time, however, she asked him to update her will. Her request was simple but unexpected. Everything she owned, from the house to her savings, would not go directly to her children. Instead, it would go to someone who truly cared about her in her final years. That person was Lily, a young neighbor who had moved in next door just 2 years earlier. Lily often brought her groceries, mowed her lawn, and sometimes sat with her in the evenings just to talk. She treated Margaret not as an obligation, but as family. There was no pity in her kindness, only genuine affection. To Maggie, that meant more than all the empty promises her children had ever made. Mr. Benson raised an eyebrow when he heard her decision. "Are you sure, Mrs. Dawson?" he asked gently. She nodded without hesitation. "They forgot me long before I left them," she said quietly. "This is not revenge, it's remembrance." She added a final request. When the time came, her children were to gather at her home, where the will would be read. She wanted them to hear it in the same house they had once filled with laughter, a reminder of what they had lost. As days passed, Margaret began to feel a strange peace. She spent her remaining time tending to her garden, the one place that still bloomed with life. Every flower held a memory: roses for her wedding, daisies for her children's laughter, and lilies for her husband's favorite scent. She tended them lovingly, as if nurturing the last pieces of her story. Neighbors often saw her sitting on the porch at sunset, a faint smile on her lips. She looked content, almost as if she knew something the world didn't. And in a way she did. She knew that when her time came, her absence would speak louder than her presence ever had. One crisp autumn morning, the mailman found the door slightly open. Inside, Margaret lay peacefully in her armchair, her favorite shawl draped over her shoulders, her eyes closed as if she were simply asleep. The house was silent, but it didn't feel sad. It felt complete, like a story that had reached its final line. When her children were notified, their reactions were distant, almost procedural. They were shocked, of course, but not in the way one would expect. Their concern seemed focused not on loss but on logistics. Who would handle the house, the money, the belongings? None of them mentioned the quiet woman who had waited years for their love. What they didn't know was that Margaret had already written the ending to their story. The morning air carried a strange stillness, as if even the wind understood that something important was about to unfold inside the little house at the end of Willow Lane. The sun hid behind a veil of clouds, leaving the world painted in muted grays and soft golds. Inside, the air was thick with the faint scent of old wood, lavender polish, and memories that had never quite faded. It was the day Margaret Dawson's family would finally return, not out of love or longing, but because of her will. For the first time in years, her driveway was full. Cars lined the street, their engines ticking softly as they cooled. The house that had stood lonely for so long now echoed faintly with footsteps, murmurs, and the rustle of coats being hung by people who once called it home. Yet despite the presence of her children and grandchildren, there was no warmth in the air, only an awkward silence that settled between them like dust on forgotten furniture. Thomas was the first to step inside. His face was drawn, his eyes darting across the room, not with nostalgia but with calculation. He looked at the walls, the photographs, the furniture, as if mentally assessing what could be sold, and what might hold value. His wife followed behind him, clutching her purse, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. Elaine arrived soon after, her expression tight, her posture stiff. She carried herself as though she were doing something unpleasant but necessary, like paying an overdue bill. Her teenage daughter scrolled idly on her phone, barely glancing around. The only person who entered quietly, without expectation or greed, was Lily. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, Margaret's favorite, and placed them gently on the table near the photo of Grandma and George. The image showed them smiling in their younger days, eyes bright, hands entwined, frozen in a time when love was simple and family was whole. Mr. Benson, the family lawyer, stood near the dining table, his briefcase neatly set beside him. He had known Margaret for over a decade, and though he had seen many families gather for such moments, few felt as heavy as this. The air around him seemed burdened with the weight of unspoken truths. The ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner filled the silence, marking the seconds like a steady heartbeat in an otherwise lifeless room. Everyone found a seat. The chairs creaked softly beneath them, the sound of age and memory whispering beneath the polished wood. No one spoke. They waited, not with grief, but with anticipation. In their minds, this was a transaction, a final settling of accounts, a distribution of what was left behind. The love that once bound them had long been replaced by the expectation of inheritance. Mr. Benson opened his folder and drew out a sealed envelope. On it, in careful handwriting, were the words, "To be read aloud to my family." The ink was slightly faded, the edges worn. He cleared his throat, and as he began, the house seemed to lean in closer, every wall and photograph listening as if they too were part of the family. Margaret's letter began softly, her tone gentle, her words tender but steady. She spoke of her love for her children, the way she had held them when they were small, the nights she had stayed awake tending to their fevers, the sacrifices she had made without question. Her love had been quiet but constant, a thread woven through the years even as it frayed with neglect. She wrote about how proud she had been when they grew up, when they built their lives and families. But somewhere along the way, distance had replaced closeness, and silence had become easier than conversation. Her words painted memories of laughter in the kitchen, of holidays spent together, of nights filled with stories and warmth. And then, just as softly, she described the years when those moments faded, the empty chairs, the unanswered calls, the birthdays she celebrated alone. The letter was not angry. It was not bitter. It was heartbreakingly kind. Margaret did not scold or accuse. She simply told the truth. the truth of a mother who had loved deeply and received only absence in return. She thanked them for the good years, for the love they once gave, and then confessed how loneliness had become her constant companion in the twilight of her life. There was a pause in the room, a silence so deep it almost hurt to breathe. Even the clock seemed to hesitate. And then, Mr. Benson continued. Margaret's words shifted, gentle still, but firm now, carrying the weight of her final decision. She explained that her estate, her home, her savings and all her possessions, would not be divided among her children. Instead, it would go to the one person who had given her what she needed most in her final years. Kindness. The name was simple. Lily Thompson. For a moment, the air seemed to vanish. Every face turned toward Lily, whose eyes widened in shock. She had not expected this, not even for a moment. She had loved Margaret sincerely, never asking for anything in return. To her, the elderly woman had been family in every way that mattered. The silence that followed was broken only by the creak of a chair as Thomas shifted uncomfortably. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched on the table. Elaine's lips parted, but no words came. Their faces twisted from disbelief to outrage to shame, all in the span of a few seconds. They had come expecting comfort and wealth, but found only the discomfort of truth. Mr. Benson read on, his voice steady despite the tension that filled the room. Margaret's letter explained that her choice was not revenge, but gratitude. She wrote that Lily had reminded her what love felt like, the kind that came without condition or obligation. She had shared her evenings, listened to her stories, brought her laughter when the house had grown too quiet. To my children, she had written, I leave my memories. I hope you will find in them what you lost, the warmth of family, the comfort of presence, and the understanding that love must be tended like a garden. To Lily I leave everything else, for she gave me what money cannot buy, company. A tear slipped from Lily's eye, though she tried to hide it. She did not look at anyone. Her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in her lap. She hadn't wanted this. She had never sought reward. Her heart ached, not with guilt, but with the deep sorrow of knowing that Margaret's love had been so unseen by her own children. Thomas stood, pacing near the window, his mind racing. He stared outside at the garden his mother had tended with so much care. The roses were in full bloom, their petals glistening faintly from the morning dew. He remembered playing there as a boy, chasing butterflies while his mother watched from the porch. But those memories felt distant now, like echoes from another life. Elaine sat rigid in her chair, her expression hollow. She remembered the times her mother had called, her voice soft and hopeful, asking when she might visit. She had always said she was too busy. Next week, Mom, she would say. There was always next week, until there wasn't. Mr. Benson continued reading the remainder of the will. The legalities were simple. The house, the savings account, the life insurance, all transferred to Lily. The remaining personal items were to be donated to charity. And in a final note, Margaret requested that her children gather every year on her birthday, not to mourn, but to remember her by sharing one meal together in peace. When the last word was spoken, Mr. Benson closed the file and placed it neatly on the table. The clock resumed its ticking, slow and steady. No one spoke. The weight of the moment pressed down like a heavy blanket, suffocating and silent. Lily rose quietly, placing a hand on the back of her chair for balance. She looked around the room. The faded wallpaper, the photographs, the sunlight streaming through the lace curtains, and felt Margaret's presence everywhere. The woman who had once sat by the window every morning, sipping tea and waiting for her family, was gone, but her spirit lingered, filling the space with the love she had never stopped giving. Outside, the garden swayed in the wind. The flowers bent gracefully, as if bowing in farewell. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of roses and earth. It was as though nature itself understood that justice, not the kind found in courtrooms, but the quiet, moral kind, had finally been served. Thomas and Elaine remained seated long after Mr. Benson left. Their anger had nowhere to go. It mingled with regret, twisting into something far heavier than either had expected to feel. For the first time in years, they looked around their mother's home, and saw not the things they might have inherited, but the life they had ignored. Every corner held a reminder of her patience, her love, her unwavering hope that one day they would return. The photographs on the mantelpiece seemed to watch them. In one, Margaret held a baby in her arms, her smile radiant. In another, the family stood together on the porch, young and happy. The images were ghosts now, haunting in their innocence. Elaine felt a lump rise in her throat as she noticed something she hadn't before. A small note pinned beside the kitchen doorway. It was old and yellowed, but the handwriting was unmistakably Margaret's. It was a grocery list. Milk, bread, apples for pie. Simple everyday things. But written beneath, in smaller letters, were 4 words. When the last word was spoken, Mr. Benson closed the file and placed it neatly on the table. The clock resumed its ticking, slow and steady. No one spoke. The weight of the moment pressed down like a heavy blanket, suffocating and silent. Lily rose quietly, placing a hand on the back of her chair for balance. She looked around the room, the faded wallpaper, the photographs, the sunlight streaming through the lace curtains, and felt Margaret's presence everywhere. The woman who had once sat by the window every morning, sipping tea and waiting for her family, was gone, but her spirit lingered, filling the space with the love she had never stopped giving. Outside, the garden swayed in the wind. The flowers bent gracefully, as if bowing in farewell. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of roses and earth. It was as though nature itself understood that justice, not the kind found in courtrooms, but the quiet, moral kind, had finally been served. Thomas and Elaine remained seated long after Mr. Benson left. Their anger had nowhere to go. It mingled with regret, twisting into something far heavier than either had expected to feel. For the first time in years, they looked around their mother's home, and saw not the things they might have inherited, but the life they had ignored. Every corner held a reminder of her patience, her love, her unwavering hope that one day they would return. The photographs on the mantelpiece seemed to watch them. In one, Margaret held a baby in her arms, her smile radiant. In another, the family stood together on the porch, young and happy. The images were ghosts now, haunting in their innocence. Elaine felt a lump rise in her throat as she noticed something she hadn't before. A small note pinned beside the kitchen doorway. It was old and yellowed, but the handwriting was unmistakably Margaret's. It was a grocery list. Milk, bread, apples for pie. Simple everyday things. But written beneath, in smaller letters, were 4 words. Love them no matter. Elaine turned away, her eyes stinging. Thomas, standing near the window, stared at the garden until his reflection blurred in the glass. They both knew, without speaking, that no amount of anger or regret could change what their mother had done, or why she had done it. Outside, Lily walked slowly down the garden path, the flowers brushing softly against her skirt. She paused by the small stone bench where Margaret used to sit in the evenings, watching the sunset. She placed a single white lily upon it, the petals trembling in the breeze. For a long moment, she stood there, her eyes closed, whispering a silent promise, to care for the home, to keep the garden alive, and to honor the woman who had given her a family when she had none. The sun broke through the clouds at last, casting golden light over the house. The windows gleamed, the flowers glowed, and the old wooden porch seemed to sigh softly in the warmth. Inside, the ticking clock continued, steady and sure, as if marking the start of something new. In time, the story of Margaret Dawson spread quietly through the neighborhood. People spoke of her not as the lonely old woman who had lived alone, but as a symbol of kindness, forgiveness, and the quiet power of remembrance. Her children, though burdened with guilt, eventually began to visit the house again. Not for what it held, but for what it represented. They found comfort in the garden, in the memories, in the faint echo of her love that refused to die. The house became a place of peace once more. On the anniversary of her passing, candles were lit in every window. Lily stood on the porch, watching the glow spread through the dusk, and smiled faintly. Margaret had been forgotten in life, but in death, she had taught everyone who knew her what it truly meant to love, to give and to be remembered. And for the first time in a very long time, the house, and the heart that had once filled it, was finally at peace.